Hello and welcome to this presentation of Herald-Standard.com editorial board. With us today, our special guest is John Maher, candidate for State Auditor General. John, welcome to our session today.
It's good to be in Uniontown.
And also with us are our editorial board members, our publisher, Bob Pinarski, our court reporter, Jennifer Haar, and community representative, Bill Long. So thank you for being with us. And John, would you like to start out just telling us a little bit about yourself, your background?
I'm an auditor. I'm a CPA. I began auditing in 1980, and since that time I've been auditing, writing about auditing, teaching about auditing, and one form or another. I'm an auditor. Back in 1997, I accidentally became a legislator. And I say accidentally because I'd never intended to run for public office. In fact, I wasn't registered in any political party. My predecessor had died unexpectedly, so the normal jockeying for a position hadn't happened. People in the community reached out to me. The message was they'd seen improvements I had made by auditing a school district, by auditing a municipality. And folks said, you know, you ought to think about serving the state legislature. And my answer to that was swift and certain, and no, not me. I'm not one of those people. I'm not a politician. That's not me. I'm an auditor. But the more I got encouragement about it, the more I thought, you know, maybe what we need is more people in government who don't intend to be there. Folks for whom it's not necessarily the chosen route, but maybe have something to offer. And so I decided to step forward. I had written standard text, co-authored a standard text in government accounting. I had audited hundreds of governments. And so I decided to enter public service. And what I found, I thought I would be bringing accountability from a fiscal standpoint with me. And what I found is that the accountability generally just wasn't there. Newspapers tend to be aware that the open records law had not advanced since 1957, before I was born. Terry, back at that time, you were at another newspaper. Mm-hmm. It's okay to mention that. And the publisher of that newspaper had been working for decades through the Pennsylvania Newspaper Association, trying to get advances in the open records law. And they had been rebuffed again and again and again. As an auditor, though, you think about certified public accountant. The reason the word public is in there is because the duty a CPA has is to the public, to ensure that what the public is told is the truth. It's a shame we don't have the same standard in government, but I decided that one of the greatest changes we could make in Pennsylvania would be to turn the lights on by pushing forward with the open records law. Not that everyone's going to look at every record, but just the fact that people can look at public documents, I think improves the behavior of those in government at state level, local level, school districts, across the board. So I battled, and it was a battle. There was only one other legislator who was willing to even co-sponsor it. It was such an unpopular idea because those in government liked the idea that they could pick and choose what information the public would see. And there really wasn't a great constituency on the other side. I will say this paper, the Herald-Standard, was a good leader in sounding the gong that we need to move forward. And in fact, I kept tapping some of your local legislators on the shoulder on your editorial page saying, get with the program. And it was helpful. But we got the open records law advanced. It's now 10 years. That was Open Records 1. And since then we've had Open Records 2, which was led from the Senate. And now we're working on Open Records 3. I know that when my public service ends, that Pennsylvania will have an enduring benefit for years to come. But having gotten done with the open records law, I then moved on to the lobbying law. Pennsylvania had no laws about lobbying, none. It was a wild, wild west. Everything was legal, everything. And that didn't seem like a very good condition to me. And everything was in the dark. Overcoming the open records and the opponents within the government was one thing. Overcoming a substantial portion of the lobbying community as well was an even taller hill. But I got that done. So now anyone can go online and look at the database and see who's being paid by whom to influence Pennsylvania government and how much they're spending. And just the fact that people can see how the dots are connected inspires a better conversation on public policy. So what I've dedicated myself to in the legislature are these reforms that have an enduring effect. And but at my heart, I'm an auditor. And our state's in a very difficult financial condition. The easy solutions are well past. What we really need to do is get after waste and fraud that's built in and not easy to spot. We need to have an auditor as Auditor General, someone who's experienced and trained, licensed to do this work. And that's why I'm stepping forward to be the CPA for PA Auditor General.
Okay, John, thank you. We do have a series of questions for you, and we'll start with our publisher, Bob Penarski.
Your predecessor, Jack Wagner, was very vocal at times at recommending changes in the law when conducting audits. Do you think recommending such changes is part of the job of being Auditor General, and would you likewise be proposing the same path, or do you think that's overstepping the duties of your office?
Well, I absolutely believe the Auditor General has a duty to make recommendations to improve Pennsylvania. That duty, though, is to be rooted in the nature of the work. Debits and credits are not partisan. The Auditor General, first and foremost, should be a finder of fact, should be making sure the public knows the truth about what's happening in government. And from that process, there are going to absolutely be recommendations that are made. One of the things that Jack has observed, and I think Jack's a very credible guy, well-intended, means very well. One of the things he's observed is that the turnpike system is overstressed, that over time it's not going to be sustainable in terms of the debt load. And I'm glad that he's saying that. But as an accountant, I did not have to wait until now to see the impact of Act 44 in terms of ultimately being not sustainable. If you go to the House Journal during the discussion about whether or not that should be passed, I pointed out then it was obvious to someone who has a bent for numbers and knows how to count that in the long run this wouldn't be sustainable. That's the sort of thing where I think there's an advantage. If we have an Auditor General who actually knows how to audit, which we've never had, I think we can really make a substantial change in Pennsylvania. Can you even imagine having an Attorney General candidate whose pitch would be, if I'm elected, I promise I'll read up on the law? You'd reject that entirely. Well, I think Pennsylvania deserves to have an Auditor General who actually knows how to audit, because there can make a difference. The Auditor General is not supposed to be some sort of shadow governor who's just using it as a soapbox and has to hire somebody else to do his job as an auditor. The Auditor General should be someone who can actually set the tone, set the culture, and go out and discover the things that need to be discovered.
Okay, good. Thank you.
One of Wagner's recommendations was more regulation of charter schools to make sure that the taxpayer money is being spent effectively. Do you agree on that issue, or do you think that charter schools need less regulation?
You know, that is a really excellent question, because it really gets to the fork in the road of what is the notion of charter schools. It seems to me that charter schools have their roots in two principal elements. One, that children deserve to have the best education that fits their needs. And not every kid is the same. And what's right for one child may not be what's right for another child. And having that choice in education, I think, is a good thing. Not everybody's going to want the alternative path, but there are kids for whom that's the right answer. But the alternative path, by definition, is something which is different. And that difference is what is defining these charter schools. Some will be terrific, some may not be terrific, but the moment that the state government starts coming in and writing a prescription for exactly what the elements are of a charter school, well, then it's just going to be the same as the public schools. So I think if we understand that charter schools are getting a fraction of what the public schools are getting, and that the basic proposition is charter schools are offered a fraction of what the public schools get, and they, though, have the same obligation to educate the child. If they can educate the child for 25% less than the public schools, I think that's a good thing if the kids are getting a good education. And to come in and micromanage them and try to tell them, wouldn't it be great? Let's flip that proposition. Let's see if we get the public schools to educate children as inexpensively as the charter schools. So my thought is that the object of the charter schools is to provide choices and some freedom. There certainly are some basic parameters you need about what's available to children, but to come in and micromanage them, I think, defeats the purpose.
Bill?
This is a multifaceted question about school districts. You'll be auditing school districts that are facing some tough budgets. What kind of advice would you be giving the districts? Do you agree with Governor Corbett, who has said that school boards need to be more responsible with taxpayers' money?
Well, I think everybody agrees that school districts should be careful with taxpayer money. And I think most school districts strive to accomplish that. Being a school director has got to be one of the toughest jobs in Pennsylvania. It's an entirely voluntary position. There's no compensation whatsoever. There are long hours, lots of meetings, an enormous amount of information to digest, process, and make decisions about. Good school directors are really unspoken or unrecognized heroes in Pennsylvania. But having said that, the question about auditing school districts is important, because the Auditor General is responsible for auditing every single school district in Pennsylvania every year. Now, at your newspaper, how many times has one of these audit reports caught your eye? Almost never. Almost never. And every one of those school districts is also being audited by an independent auditing firm. So, what question is it that the Auditor General is asking these school districts? From a big picture perspective, does it make sense to keep asking a question where the answer doesn't make any difference? Because apparently whatever questions they're asking, the answers don't make any difference, or you'd know about it. It's an enormous amount of resources that are expended auditing 500 school districts. And I think we really need to take a look at, is that information helpful? As a person who's audited, I have audited school districts, plenty of them, in the free world with the business I built. So I know a thing or two about auditing school districts. And I think we can change the perspective of what the Auditor General does, so that at one hand he's a cop, but the other hand he should be a coach. He should be bringing best practice information to districts who are, as you mentioned, doing what they can. They face great challenges. Well, as an Auditor General, if you can see practices that seem to be efficient and effective and clever in School District A, well, for heaven's sakes, pass that along to School District B. But that doesn't happen now. I want to make that happen.
You're saying you view them as insular?
No, I'm not saying school districts are insular. What I'm saying is that these audits have not been very useful information to school directors or to the school districts. Just not useful information. If you ask school districts and the board members, if you ask the administration, the business managers, the superintendents, what they do with those audit reports from the state, it's a pretty short answer. They go in a drawer. And that's it. No one's saying, thank goodness we have this insight. I'm so glad these auditors were here because they brought wisdom with them. That's not happening now, but it should be happening now. People are walking down that path. People are looking at the same invoices. They're looking at the same accounting systems, the same everything. Well, through that process, there should be wisdom that comes with it, not just a report that winds up in a file drawer. And as someone who's actually audited school districts and done that, I believe we can re-establish the way that the Auditor General's office goes about auditing school districts in a way that's asking questions for which the answers are meaningful.
Can I rephrase that succinctly in saying you're looking at the audits as a tool for improvement?
Correct. Correct. There's a cop function, but a coach function.
Good.
The Auditor General should be both.
John, if elected, what would be your first major project?
My first major project would be to take inventory. There's 600 people in the Auditor General's office, more or less. It's responsible for conducting audits of the entire state, myriad authorities, school districts, municipalities that receive road money, state system schools, state-related schools, on and on and on. My impression from outside is that much of what happens in the Auditor General's office today is the same thing that happened last year and 5 years ago and 20 years ago. The world has changed. The focus of the effort should change as well. As someone who is an experienced auditor, who's experienced auditing governments, who's taught about auditing internationally, taught at Cambridge University in England on a repeated basis with audiences of law enforcement, attorneys general, Interpol, Europol, folks who want to know how do you do forensic auditing, how do you audit governments, that I'm really pretty good at it, and I like it. I really do like auditing. Auditing, in fact, I say, is a bit like reporting if you're doing it right. That you go in and you gather evidence and you try to understand what does this really mean and what is meaningful that should come out of it. Because you could just print every scratch of information you pick up, but without context, without sorting it out to know what is really important in here, it would just be a mess. Well, there's an art to that. And I'd suggest that when you think about auditing, because it's hard to explain in a sentence what an auditor does, just like I think it's, people may know what reporters do, but it's notional. I would put this proposition to you. A newspaper that's edited by someone who doesn't know anything about journalism is going to look quite a bit different over time than a newspaper edited by someone who does. And you can't exactly put your finger on what that change is day by day. And certainly, if your editor were to be someone who was just a well-intended person who walked in off the sidewalk, the newspaper would come out tomorrow, and tomorrow it would be fine. It'll come out the day after that. But over time, it's going to be a very different newspaper. And I think the same is true about the Auditor General's office. We have never had an Auditor General who is a licensed CPA. We've never had an Auditor General who knew how to audit. I think having that newspaper with an editor who actually knows how to report can have a transformational benefit to the people of Pennsylvania.
Once you take your initial inventory, which will help get you up to speed, do you think then you would focus on a sore spot to address as the next major project beyond the inventory?
Well, sure. There's a long list. Big picture, places and areas where there are significant changes tend to be where there's the most likely disconnect between what was intended and what happens. Over time, things tend to sort themselves out. One of those areas of change is obviously dealing with the boom in Marcellus. 10 years ago, you could keep track in your head of the number of wells being drilled in Pennsylvania. There were 6 or 8 or 10 a year. And so the systems that existed in state government to ensure environmental compliance, to ensure worker safety, to take care of all those things that we intend to do, that government means to do, you didn't really need much of a system. You could keep track of it. People could keep track of it in their heads. But now when there's 1,000 well sites, you need to have a system. That system did not exist a year and a half ago. This system's being built. I believe the Auditor General, a year from now, when I'm Auditor General, should be looking at that system to see if it's working as intended to protect the air, protect the water, protect workers, protect the environment. And it doesn't mean that I'm going out with a test tube and testing the water. That's somebody else's job. But you want to make sure that job's happening. You want to make sure that those results are being contemplated and that people are acting upon them. Because that's what's supposed to be happening. And as Auditor General, you want to make sure there's a system of checks and balances to ensure the net that's supposed to be there is there and that it's working. That's area one. Area two, healthcare is changing. We don't exactly know where it's going to be going yet. Some of that will be decided based upon November or January, but this much we know. Healthcare is changing, and it's going to change the relationship of insurers with customers. It's going to change the relationship of the state with its customers, the people of the state. There are going to be all sorts of changes. Now, these changes start out in Washington as some big picture requirement, and they come to the state, and the state's supposed to be adjusting, and insurers are supposed to be adjusting, and employers are supposed to be adjusting. But there needs to be an auditing exercise to determine whether or not patients' safety is being met, whether or not the system of insuring coverage is in place as intended. That where we have monumental changes underway, there needs to be auditing quickly behind those changes to make sure that things are being done right. Because it's great to pass a law and say this will happen, but someone needs to make sure it's actually happening. And that's the Auditor General's job.
Thank you, John. Next question.
With the Republicans controlling both the governor's mansion and the Senate and the House, do you feel that you'll be able to investigate state government fairly and independently? And do you have any concerns at all that you'll be an effective watchdog?
No, I think the evidence is pretty clear that as the guy who overcame entrenched opposition, Republican and Democrat, to open records law, as the guy who overcame entrenched opposition, Republican and Democrat, to the lobbying law, to the guy who overcame entrenched opposition to streamlining local tax collection from Republicans and Democrats across the state, I've never really worried too much about who's unhappy about things that need to be accomplished, if I believe they need to be accomplished. And as I said earlier, debits and credits are not partisan. It's a question of truth. And you arm the public with the truth, matter-of-factly. That's the job of the Auditor General. I do think that my opponent has been saying that his goal is to be a counterweight on policy questions because of the partisan thing. That's not the Auditor General's job. It's just not. And for someone who would be serving as Auditor General with that bent, that it's some sort of a partisan post, well, the first thing that person needs to do then is to hire somebody to actually do his job. And so the guy who's supposed to be the watchdog for waste, the first step he has to do is to waste. Doesn't make a lot of sense to me. But I think my record's pretty darn clear. I'm an independent-minded, reform-oriented CPA who's at his heart an auditor.
Very good, thank you.
We've touched upon this, but what do you think the biggest difference is between you and your opponent, and what can you do as a CPA that he can't do? Additionally, what types of different things will you be able to do as a CPA that former Auditor Generals weren't able to?
Well, it's pretty stark. My opponent's a very nice guy. I like him on a personal level. There's some pretty stark differences, though. I am an auditor. I've been an auditor since 1980. Audited, taught about auditing, written about auditing. I know how to audit. He has no relevant experience. He's a career politician who's had a series of patronage jobs and was elected. I think the only job he's had in the private sector as an adult was with a lobbying firm. He's very much of government, being in industry. He's a full-time, permanent politician kind of guy. I come from the real world and I bring that perspective. I built jobs, real jobs, jobs that endure today, and I'm very proud of the firm that I founded, not just because it's a darn good auditing firm. And I stepped away from practice a number of years ago to dedicate myself to public service. It certainly would have been more lucrative for me to stay in public practice instead of public service. But the world's been good to me, and I decided to step away and serve. But one of the things I'm proud about is that firm that created great jobs, back when I had a notion of how to build an accounting firm that was different from its predecessors, one of my goals was to make it a place where people could actually pursue their profession while promoting the greater good. And that's why the firm was dedicated to serving public sector entities, governments, and charities, with the notion being at the end of the day, you could feel better that you had made the world a bit better. But part of the context of that is treating people right. And when I created this firm with a notion, and before there were any of these Best Places to Work awards, now there's a number of these Best Places to Work, and I'm proud to say that firm regularly is recognized one of the best places to work, which is pretty good. I mention this in the sense that one of the important differences, I know how to build an organization. I know how to create jobs in a real sense, not by handing out government money, which doesn't really create jobs. It just subsidizes somebody else's job creation. And I think we really have touched on where it will make a difference as an auditor, is that I actually know how to audit. I can transform that office so that we can discover the things that need to be discovered, so that we can coach school districts and make those experiences valuable instead of just rote.
Bill, you want to move on to the 8th question?
Yes, thank you. Totally different topic. Do you support the new voter ID law? Do you think the state is doing all it can to make sure voters will be able to present IDs needed to vote? And then, is there anything you think should be done differently than what's going on now?
I do support voter identification. I do think that ensuring that every vote counts is part of that, is making sure that only real votes get registered. It's clear that the state is doing all sorts of things, and I think one of the nice things about the controversy is it keeps reminding folks, make sure you got your ID on election day. I don't think there will be anybody voting in November who isn't aware that they need to bring their ID.
Okay. You'd mentioned Marcellus Shale natural gas industry. Do you think the state is currently doing a good job with regulating the industry, and what would you do differently in office?
Well, certainly the law that was adopted earlier this year that covered a lot of subjects actually improved the environmental requirements, the setbacks from water, the air standards, and so forth. Now, certainly some folks say, well, we'd want it even stricter, but it's considerably stricter than it was, so it was a very important step forward. But having these laws in the books is one thing, making sure that they're being enforced is another thing. And as Auditor General, I would make sure that systems are in place to test whether or not these laws are being enforced, because they can't simply be notional. We have to make sure that DEP has got folks who know what their job is, and have systems to ensure that they are keeping an eye on every well site, on every pipeline, on every plant compressor. We need to make sure nothing's falling through the cracks.
So you'd say you'd take a more active role?
Absolutely. It gets back to that these things should be systematic. There ought to be a way to ensure. There's got to be a system to say we've got these 1,000 wells out there, whatever the total number is. There's this many miles of pipeline. It's got to be a system and a plan to know when these are being inspected, when they should be inspected, when reports are due. What are the triggers for further action? This should all be standardized so that you make sure that every well is covered, every inch of pipeline is covered, every compressor plant is covered. Because if you don't have a system to do that, there are going to be ones that just aren't observed. We need to make sure it's all observed, make sure it's all regulated as intended, which is different than the Auditor General creating his own standards. And I think that's a very important difference here, is that the job of the Auditor General is to make sure that the law is in fact being enforced effectively by the executive branch that's required to do it.
Okay, thank you.
You've talked about your commitment and support of the open records law. As Auditor General, is there anything you can do to make sure government officials are held more accountable?
Oh, absolutely. And I always happy to talk about open records. And in fact, the Pennsylvania Newspaper Association, after Open Records 1 passed 10 years ago, actually created an award for distinguished public service in the advancement of freedom of information that is called the Bill Northrop Award. I think you know Bill. Yes. I don't know if you do know Bill. He's a retired publisher from the Washington Observer Reporter. And to my knowledge, that award's only been given out a couple of times. And the first time it was given out was to me. and it's something that I really do treasure because Bill and I had worked arm in arm to try to get the first open records bill through. But just like we were talking about with Marcellus, the open records law contains a series of steps. One of them is saying that a government entity must respond. However, it can have up to 30 days to respond if one of these conditions is made. Well, what we've seen happen is that maximum amount of time has become standard operating procedure. Everything takes 30 days. Well, it shouldn't be like that. And I think that the Auditor General, one of the things the Auditor General should be looking at when it visits school districts, when it visits municipalities, when it visits every level of government, is what is your standards, what are your procedures for handling open records. And if every response requires 30 days, it seems to me it's working to defeat the point. That's supposed to be an exception, not the standard. And I think that's one of the things as an Auditor General can do, is ensuring that the laws that exist, that there are actually systems in place to make sure the public's being served the way it's supposed to be.
Okay, thank you. Any follow-up questions from the board?
I do have a small question, just a bit of an aside than a question. As a planner, I can certainly am encouraged about your desire for audits to be used in a constructive manner. Lots of times I've been involved with plans, they end up in the drawer, so I can certainly appreciate that. Would you consider yourself to be efficient and can take charge quickly if you assume the role of Auditor General?
I think I've got a pretty good record of taking charge, whether it was rising through the ranks of the Pittsburgh office, one of the big 8 firms. Now they're big 4, but it was big 8 back then. When it was pioneering, creating a firm from scratch to compete against the national firms, which nobody did, and growing it to be a pretty healthy size CPA firm. When it was going as a complete neophyte into the legislature, and in my second term, having accomplished an advance that the newspapers collectively for almost 50 years had not been able to get done, that I have the ability to go in and find a path and get things done. And if I'm able to do it in my sweet spot as an auditor, I can't wait. We're gonna make a difference for Pennsylvania. I'm very excited about being the auditor for Pennsylvania.
Thank you.
Well, that's the end of our formal questions, John. Are there any areas that we didn't touch on that you would like to address?
Well, I could talk about auditing all day long. In any dimension, but I'm not sure your readers and viewers would find that altogether entertaining. But I do think it will illustrate again that frankly, this is not a job where someone should be putting on the training wheels and trying to figure out what it means to be an auditor. This is a job that as Auditor General for the state, if someone steps in there who really knows what they're doing, we can really make a difference. And with the help of the voters, they're going to have a choice this year. Do they want a CPA, 4PA Auditor General? I might mention, if I could, put a little plug in there. If you want to learn more, www.cpa4pa.com. Is that enough?
That's good. That's good.
Okay.
Well, that concludes our presentation today. We thank John Maher, Republican candidate for Auditor General, for joining us today. I'm Terry Sneed, Managing Editor of Content for Herald-Standard.com, and we thank you for watching, and we'll see you again.